Mr. Moran. There we go.
There we are. Hi, everybody. I'm going to speak a little bit about Latin tonight, but I think before I do, I'd like to speak about learning a new language or learning a foreign language, however you like to put it. It's valuable in itself. Many schools choose languages that they tend to focus on, and I'm not here to necessarily criticize anyone for choosing a language other than Latin to teach young people, because again, I think that the learning of any language is very valuable for many of the reasons why studying Latin is valuable. The difference, of course, is that Latin is taught in a kind of different way most of the time, although I will note, and Jill knows this even better, much better than I, that in the modern era, by that I mean the 21st century, there's a movement afoot to begin to teach Latin in a kind of conversational way, leading students through question and answer and a kind of expository thinking and speaking to an understanding of the language. It's developing. It's hard to do. It's something that I'm not particularly at the moment suited to do. I suppose if I was asked to do it, I might have to consider whether I was too old a dog, or as I would say, a canis senior, to learn it. But at any rate, learning a language is very valuable intrinsically for itself. It enables us to become more human. It enables us to think about other people in a thoughtful way, and begins to help us understand how language develops and the similarities and differences between language. So those sorts of things, comparison, seeing what's similar, all are kind of rational things that are good for young people to think about, and maybe not necessarily to think deeply about, but at least to begin to think about. Latin in particular, I believe, is extremely useful for the development of memory. At a kind of deeper level than a lot of the learning that is essential and very important in young people's lives, but which doesn't necessarily approach the child's mind in a way that is respectful of it. Let me put it this way. There's a lot of ambiguity in the Latin language, and the children actually understand that there's an ambiguity in the Latin language. They don't exactly know how to express it, but they do know it. And it's useful for children to think about ambiguous things because it enables them to sharpen their reasoning and to throw things in and throw things out, which is actually the beginning of real thinking and real learning. So vocabulary acquisition in Latin, which we do stress, and it's important, but it's actually an aspect of mastery. And on top of it is something that gives children immediate feedback with regard to the learning that's expected of them. There's a great deal of educational stuff out there about feedback, and let's make feedback scientific. And here are the 6 things about feedback that have to be present. And if they're not there, you haven't done it well. So I would like you to reflect for a while on the amount of feedback that you're giving. All of that's probably true. But on the other hand, in a Latin class, the feedback for students when they're given discrete tasks is almost immediate. And they like it. The truth is that children like being given odd things to do, strange things to do, and they like to demonstrate that they've done it. We do that very well, I think, at Regina Pacis Academy in the early years, in 3rd and 4th grade, in 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th and 8th. And over time, we kind of build this up in them so that by the time they've finished with us, whether they continue in Latin or not, and let us all hope that they do, but whether they continue in Latin or not, they will be able at least to say that they struggled, that they managed, and that some of them achieved a level of mastery that gave them confidence in their ability to tackle increasingly difficult things. So as a general educational matter, studying Latin is extremely beneficial. At RPA, as soon as we can, generally in 5th grade, we ask students to think for themselves as they acquire vocabulary. Now, what do you mean by that, Mr. Moran? Well, what we mean by it is a kind of speculative performance. Children love to see their teachers speculate. They're particularly when you get into 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they're incredibly interested to see their teachers maybe go off on a digression or jump to something completely different that came into their minds and weave something for them, which at the end of it, and they don't see it coming, at the end of it kind of brings the meaning of the lesson more deeply towards them. And to have them think with their teachers is extremely, extremely useful. And Jill does this, Mrs. Chessman does this very well. She does it differently from me, but she does it very, very well. One of the things we love about teaching Latin is, again, it's ambiguous sometimes. It's really hard. Word order is very strange. What is going on in this sentence, Mr. Moran? Well, let's think together about it. There are some things here that I know you recognize, yes? And most of the children would recognize it. Some don't, but that's all right. So it's interesting to be a teacher of young people because you can kind of help them learn how to think, which is a wonderful opportunity. So we spend a lot of time in my Latin classes thinking about words. And I know that some of my fellow teachers do the same thing, maybe in a different kind of way, but I'm constantly talking to my students about the meaning of Latin words and that they actually know more about this word than they think they know because they've never really stopped to actually think about the meaning of, a verb like, recipio, recipere, recipi, receptum. They kind of see it, they memorize it, and they say, okay, I got that memorized. It means to take back or receive. But instead, I asked them to look at it and say, okay, so what's a derivative of that one? Oh, reception, yes. Recipient, yes. What other words? Well, what about perception? Yeah. What about inception? Yes. And so all of a sudden, they're drawing connections between words and understanding that words come from somewhere. Now, I don't take them all the way back to Indo-European roots and what does MOS always mean and what does AH always mean and that sort of thing. But we do spend a great deal of time thinking together about words. The reason we do is that I don't want them constantly to be thinking about vocabulary A through H or A through Z. I want them to start reading, and I want them to start reading Latin, and I want them to see the word edificium, which means building, by the way. It comes from two words meaning to make a house. Edificium. I want them to see it being used, and they might see it in a passage where it turns into a verb. Oh, my goodness, Mr. Moran, that looks like edificium. Yes, it is. And what do you think ficium comes from? Then they might say, well, does it come from facio, facere, feci, factum? And yes, it does. And then all of a sudden, a whole bunch of words, not in that lesson, but a whole panoply of words becomes available to them. And they're not just words that they see in Latin, they're words that they see in English. So the idea here is to wake up the intelligence of our children. And we do it in Latin because it's hard. And in order to do it well, you have to really, really be willing to think. And so this thinking that we do doesn't always seem to be perfectly linear, but it does have a purpose. I would like to talk briefly about an educational fad that I'm familiar with, because I used to teach at a school that adopts the latest brain thinking that is coming out of research. Between you and me and the lamppost, all of this new brain thinking is stuff that somebody dreamed up 75 years ago before they had instruments to measure electrical things in people's brains, but were really just conclusions drawn from observation of the activities of persons, not from what's going on in their brains. There is good science about how you light up a brain. Yes, there is that. But at any rate, the latest fad, just so you know, is where students at the end of a unit, or maybe at the end of a class even, or maybe at the end of 15 minutes of a lesson, are asked to sit down and think about what they just learned, describe how they felt about learning it, what was hard about it, what was easy about it, what they thought at the beginning, what they thought at the end, and what they learned about themselves in doing so. Most children, just so you know, most children, particularly 6th, 7th, and 8th grade children, in my experience, and I've taught a bunch of them, hate this. They do not want to share these somewhat intimate thoughts that they're having. They don't even think those intimate thoughts are worthy of putting down on a piece of paper. They hate it. So what happened to me in my classes at this school? The poor children would come in dragging, saying, oh, Mr. Moran, we just had to do a long reflection in science. I said, oh, well, yeah, there's some value in reflecting. They said, Mr. Moran, we love Latin. because we never have to do any reflecting. And I said to them, ha, 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 you think you don't, but you do it every day. Whenever we talk about derivatives of Latin words, what are you doing? And the scales fall from their eyes, and they look at me and they say, is that what the head of the school likes to refer to as metacognition? Yes, that is what the head of the school likes to refer to as metacognition. Metacognition is simply a fancy term for thinking about thinking. Yeah, that's all it is. It's giving, it's an interior attitude towards the things that you're thinking about. I don't spend all day asking the kids to think about thinking, but whenever I ask them what a derivative of ideficium is, and they cross their eyes, I say, well, maybe you don't know this word yet, but you will know it. And it's edifice, which simply means a building. And it comes from ideficium. And it comes actually from two words to build something up. And that's what the word edify means. And we just quickly move on, quickly. We don't have to comment on it or say, oh, isn't that Mr. Moran? Amazing that he knows all these words. The truth is, of course, that I've been spending a lot of my life thinking about words. As I see my colleague laughing, it's what I do. And so this thinking about thinking, or this reflection, is what goes on in Latin all the time. It's essential. You have to have ideas in your head in order to understand what is happening on the page that you're reading. So, so thinking about thinking is not exactly what we do, but I do guide the children in the class about things like derivatives and why it's useful to know them. So I do some of the things that modern people suggest be done, but I don't do them because of some modern theory. It's just that we know that these things work. And we know that if you teach it in a way that's lively and fun, it works. So what's the other reason? Another good reason for teaching Latin is it's really complex. It requires a great deal of understanding of our own language. And without an understanding of our own language, it's extremely difficult to teach. One of the reasons that it's being taught in this new way, conversationally, in a variety of sort of new forms, is that there are a lot of teachers who don't like teaching in a kind of analytical, complex sort of way. Happily, I kind of do. The formal study of Latin of necessity breaks sentences down into their constituent parts. There are subjects, objects, direct and indirect. There are tenses. There are prepositional phrases, adjectives, adverbs, the indicative and subjunctive moods, the active and the passive voice. All of this terminology can, if it's sort of pounded on your children or my students, can lead to a great deal of, difficulty. And one might also conclude by saying it can lead to disaster. So what one does is one just keeps talking about it and not stopping to explain it every time, but just keep talking about it. And eventually the children get used to the phrases and get used to the terminology and actually really want to know what exactly the passive voice is. And those are things that are going to be valuable to our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders for the rest of their lives. And they're useful to know in themselves. So again, I believe this, and it makes me sound like a kind of what should I say, highly idealistic person. And if you've ever practiced law in Manhattan, it's hard to keep your ideals. But I'm a pretty idealistic person, at least about people, and that there is something in all of these children that clearly shows that they were created by God. There are a variety of things that you can tease out of them to see this. And the thing that I see in teaching Latin is this desire that God gave us because we're like him, to know. There is a desire in our children to know. And it doesn't really matter exactly what it is, but this desire to know, if it can be encouraged, and it takes a certain amount of watering, and sometimes it doesn't take, and sometimes the plant doesn't really grow as fast as you might like it to. But this desire to know is one of the things that makes us like our Creator and makes us most like our Creator. And therefore, drawing it out of children for at least a Catholic teacher is a great opportunity, which, I love Latin, and I love teaching it, and I've taught it in a variety of places, but I like it the best at Regina Pacis because they believe that too. And it makes it easier for me to teach the way I want to teach. On top of it, once these kids understand all of these constituents of language, they have to develop an appreciation of complexity, and they've got to become better readers, and they've got to become better writers. If we present to them material that is well written, and we do that, by the way, I've noticed it in every different class that I've observed at Regina Pacis, that Regina Pacis takes great care in what they present to their children as models. It's really quite remarkable. But, with the 8th graders, I have been having them, those of you who know Latin won't be surprised, but I've been having them memorize the first 7 lines of the Aeneid, learning how to pronounce it. And I'll read 3 lines for you briefly. The first 3 lines of book 1. Arma virumque cano Troiae, qui primus aboris, Italiam fato profugus lavinia venit litera. 3, really 2 lines that are so packed with meaning. Latin is incredibly compact. These 3 lines describe the entire 12,000 line poem in just two and a half lines. It's about battles. That's arma. And a man, that's virum. By the way, virumque means and the man. Cano just means I'm a poet, so I'm going to sing about it. And then it goes on, Troiae qui primus aboris, which is wonderful to teach 8th graders because they've already learned what qui means, and they know what qui is going to tell them. It's going to tell them something about the antecedent of qui, which is who. It's virum, the man, who, driven by fate into exile, first came to Italy. and the Lavinian shores. Lavinian shores, it's a remarkable thing to say. The Italians had this idea that there was this area in Latium near where the Tiber River comes out that got the name Lavinia or Lavinium from the daughter of the king of the area where Aeneas, the hero of the poem, comes first. And her name was Lavinia. I'll give you a brief aside. I just bought a sailboat and I was thinking about what I would name it. And I said to Fanny, I think I might name it Lavinia. Lavinia, we hardly know anything about her, but she was a wonderful woman. But I told Fanny about her and he said, no. She said, no, you can't do that. So I didn't name the boat Lavinia, but that's all right. I'm going to read something else. That was from the Aeneid of Virgil. I'm going to read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more lines of Virgil. This is from the first eclogue, which he wrote before he wrote the Aeneid, which is wonderful, so incredibly beautiful, so very different sort of subject matter, but lovely. So just listen. Titire tu patulae recuban subtegmine fagi, silvestrem tenuimusam meditaris avena. Nos, patriae finis et dulcia linquimus arva, nos patriam fugimus, tu, titire, lentus in umbra, formosam resonare, doces amarilidas silvas. That is so beautiful just to say. It is a treat to just be able to read it and read it the way Virgil expected it to sound. It is a poem about about goat herds and sheep herds, and but it's much more about the country. It's pastoral poetry, very different from epic, but quite beautiful in its kind of smaller sort of way. Most people who have appreciated Virgil have really appreciated those lines in particular because they start the eclogues. So I read these things. What does this have to do with Regina Pacis Academy? I read these things to the children. I don't ask them to know what it means. I just read them to them because I'm trying to demonstrate to them that at least for one person, there's some value to knowing this and that it's meaningful to him. And I will tell you, it's incredibly meaningful to me for a variety of reasons. But one particular reason is that I was lucky when I was in college, Jill knows this, that to take a number of classes from one of the greatest scholars of Virgil ever, at any time, ever, an American. The English professors couldn't believe that there was such a sophisticated American professor. Well, his name was Wendell Clausen. And if you want to know how I think, you can Google his name, Wendell, Wendell, Clausen, Clausen, and the word next to it, Aeneid, Aeneid, and you will see a video of Wendell Clausen reciting the first 10 lines of the Aeneid. He was a great man. I have to say, I was not a great student, but he was a great man. And so to be able to sort of think about some connection to it, it keeps me going. So what else do? We build up the students. We do all kinds of different things. We have, play acting. We have people impersonating others. The stories themselves are humorous from time to time, many examples of characters impersonating others, getting into scrapes, acting like fools. Children love this. And there's nothing wrong with it in Latin because comedy was a very important part of the culture of Roman literary history. We also asked them to take the National Latin exam. These are things that build them up. It gives them opportunities to imagine themselves as Latin scholars. We also are able to bring in history and culture. My particular thing that I try to do with these children, because they haven't thought about this much, is I focus a lot on the concepts of slavery, citizenship, cultural appropriation, empire building, but mostly I talk about status because I want them to know that the culture that the Romans lived in was entirely based on status. It was not easy to change your status in the Mediterranean world that we're dealing with. It happened. Slaves were freed. Freedmen became wealthy. Freedmen became right-hand men of emperors, most of the time because I think the emperors felt that they could dominate them more securely than perhaps ordinary citizens. But I do want them to understand that unlike Romans, they're not born into any fixed status other than as children of God, and as such have a value not assigned and fixed by others, but by their creator, which I think is an important thing for them to think about. And I think it's very important for an American person to think about, but I don't think that it's an American concept. It's a universal concept that is very important. Now, as far as the church is concerned, it seems to have pleased God that that early primacy was granted to the city of Rome, the city of Saints Peter and Paul. Natural adoption of Latin by the church, thus, gave the language power and authority that's lasted. Latin Mass is a great gift to all of us. The Gloria is one of the most ancient hymns that is available to us. The Creed contains the deepest mysteries of our religion. Credo in unum Deum, here's one. Credo in unum Deum, we translate that properly as I believe in one God, yeah? Right? Everybody knows that. Well, except if you're a Latin teacher or a real knower of Latin, you will note that the object of the preposition in this sentence is in the accusative case. It's not uno Deo, it's unum Deum. Now, there are a zillion different things I could say about that, but the one thing I will tell you about is that in, when it takes the accusative case, implies motion towards. So this belief in one God implies our motion towards and into the Godhead, which requires activity on our part. And so it actually gets me out of bed to teach Latin at RPA, to think about that and put it into a different kind of context. You'll also note that every time that we talk about the persons, the three persons in one God, Iesum Christum in the Creed is in the accusative case, as is Spiritum Sanctum. All three involve a motion towards God. The monks up at Portsmouth, where I went to school, used to say, draw near to God and God will draw near to you. That's a quotation from some great theologian. It's all true. Latin can be so ambiguous that you finally bring yourself to it. And that's what I bring to the Credo in unum Deum. It's one of the great things about Latin, that it is ambiguous, that there are different readings. Happily, we have the church to correct us whenever we may misread something that pertains to our religion, but it does enable someone with a sort of speculative mind to actually think about what he's saying when he says the creed. So now that we use the vernacular for it, I believe in one God. Well, for me at least, I've got in the back of my head that there's some motion connected to that belief that God is expecting from us, because it's credo in unum Deum, which implies motion toward. So that's kind of a kind of desultory, what should I say? It's kind of a not exactly a complete précis for why we should teach Latin, but it does give you a sense of why it's valuable, why we do it, and with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have of me.